This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey everybody, this is Razib Khan with the Unsupervised Learning Podcast, and I am here with Diana Fleischman of Aporia magazine. She's also an evolutionary psychologist who has a research appointment at the University of New Mexico, and she has been involved in the field for many decades now. So I want to start off with asking you, I guess, what is evolutionary psychology? How would you define it? What are the presuppositions or premises of the field? So we can just kind of understand as we're going forward what we're talking about.
Cool. Evolutionary psychology is the idea that the human mind has adaptations for solving certain problems that were recurrent throughout deep history. So problems like finding a mate, finding food, avoiding aggression, avoiding disease. These are the kinds of problems that evolutionary psychology deals with. And there's a couple different main schools of evolutionary psychology, but the main one, which is the Santa Barbara School, Leda Cosmides and John Tooby, they have this idea that the mind is actually sort of a set of modules or like programs. And instead of the mind being some kind of general purpose mechanism, in fact, we have programs that solve specific kinds of adaptive problems. And that's generally what most evolutionary psychologists think. There's also some other suppositions that have been challenged or unchallenged over time. One of them is that there's a psychic unity of mankind, that all human beings everywhere have a similar psychology or psychological architecture, which is something that is a little bit controversial, and also that there are significant sex differences between men and women and in terms of their psychology, considering that they had to solve very different adaptive problems throughout evolutionary history.
Yeah, so I mean, the sex differences thing I think was traditionally the least controversial aspect, but I feel like in the last couple of years, last 5 years, it's gotten like quite muddled. How has evolutionary psychology dealt with the changing tenor of the culture?
One interesting thing that's happened is I think that there is going to be a woke and an anti-woke evolutionary sciences. There seems to be a schism happening right now. And on a recent conversation with Mike Bailey, who's a sexologist and whose son is an evolutionary psychologist, we had this conversation about, whether it's not best actually for different societies. Like now with sex research, there's two societies. There's a woke and an anti-woke kind of sex research society. But the European Human Behavior and Evolution Association is really into anthropology, human behavior ecology. They tend to actually collect data out in the field, and they have very few evolutionary psychologists and very few evolutionary psychology sessions in their conference. And one of the main people there is called Rebecca Sear. She's a demographer, and she's very against, what she thinks are some of the excesses of evolutionary psychology, including overestimating sex differences. You'll get a sense with the European Human and Behavior and Evolution Association, which met back in April. Their keynote was Adam Rutherford, which I don't think that Adam Rutherford would be a keynote at the Human Behavior and Evolution Society in the United States. Whereas HBES in the United States is really much more focused on evolutionary psychology, sex differences. There's some really fun kind of talks and ideas that are being thrown around. I think they had a whole session like on incels, and that's quite different than so those two societies seem to have a rift. And I think the European Human Behavior and Evolution Association, they are also like probably much less in favor of talking about sex differences. If you look at some people involved in that, I think like David Geary, David Schmidt, David Buss, all the Davids, they're all much more into sex differences. And while they're welcome in both conferences, I just don't think that there would be like a whole session on sex differences at EB, which is what it's called, as opposed to HBES. So, maybe that's a good thing. I don't know if that's something that's also happening in behavior genetics or in other fields.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think in behavioral genetics it's the opposite. In terms of the woke, the stuff, is stronger in the United States than it is in Europe,
Uh,
and some of the some I will tell you, I mean, this happened years ago, so not that many years ago, but I think I can tell you. But there were some things related to sex differences and sexual harassment and microaggressions and other sorts of things. From what I've heard in the behavioral genetics community in their conferences, and basically the Americans won because they had more people, but the Americans were pushing the more progressive social justice positions, and the Europeans, a lot of these Europeans, like, they're not conservative, they're socialists and stuff, but they were resisting. So it seems like in the behavioral genetics community, it is the opposite. I do have to say, in the genetics community as a whole, definitely people in the United States are more woke. So evolutionary psychology, or like, this field seems to be, and I know Rebecca Sear a little bit. She was on the Insight back before she had her awakening. Because, yeah, I mean, I know she's a big activist right now. She wasn't like that 5 years ago. I don't know what happened,
no,
but
she's changed quite a lot. I used to, I mean, I was at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I've been out with her in groups several times, so that we had no problems before fairly recently. But just I don't want to get too far afield here, but yeah, in the HBS there was also like a reckoning about whatever sexual harassment, and we actually ended up collecting data. I think there were 300 respondents, and 3 people said that they had been asked out, and 1 person said that it was persistent in a way that they didn't enjoy. And so certainly there are some people who'd say that was one too many, but I don't think like 1 out of 300 people is a particularly pervasive problem.
I mean, yeah. I mean, okay, so evolutionary psychology, of course, like, you would do a survey, and you would be interested in sexual harassment, like, not in sexually harassing, but in the topic, because evolutionary psychology, stylized fact, like, you guys are obsessed with sex, right?
Yeah, so we are obsessed with sex. No, there's two filters in terms of whether your genes get into the next generation. One of those filters is if you survive, which is much less sexier than the other filter, which is whether you have sex and whether somebody wants to have sex with you. And so reproductive success is very important. But there's also this other factor of sex, which is that in our species, sex is used for a variety of reasons other than just reproduction. It's also used to make alliances, to show affiliation. I've written about this. I wrote about bisexuality a lot when I was in graduate school, and what I said essentially is that there's a continuum of affection to sex, and that we use sex as a reward to facilitate behavior that's in our adaptive interests. So we're not like bonobos where we're having sex all the time, but we're also not like chimps, who are very rarely have kind of same sex sexual relationships. And if you ask bonobo researchers, um, there's this bonobo research station where I was talking to one of the researchers, and she was saying you could take all the bonobos, open up all the gates, and let all the different groups mingle together. And while there'd be a bit of frenzied humping, it wouldn't end up with bloodshed. Whereas if you had a big group of chimps together and you let them all interact with each other, there would be almost certainly a serious injury or death. So that's the difference in species that can have sex for affiliation and those that can't.
Actually, you just dropped in the bonobo there, and, like, I feel like, I know what that is. I've read my Franz de Waal or whatever. Can you talk about bonobos and common chimpanzees? Because
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of our discussions are based on primatology and bonobos and common chimpanzee fieldwork, but the two species are quite different, and I feel that what researchers generalize about primates, quote unquote apes, our lineage, varies based on what they study, and that's a little weird to me.
It's a little weird to you what? The primates that people study, how they influence their perception of human behavior?
Oh, okay, so I don't know. I think Wrangham, he studies common chimpanzees, right? Richard Wrangham,
I
right?
think so, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So we talk about, like, I mean, I think he's written about violence and stuff like that, and then some researcher, I think DeWall, studies bonobos, bonobos. I don't know how people say it, but I've heard different things.
There's 2 different ways to say it.
Yeah, they're like, oh, like, they're the sexy ape, and so we're talking about sex all the time, and, like, look, we're not common chimpanzees or bonobos, so Like how are we gonna, and like, phylogenetically, we are equally distant to both of them because they're in a clade by themselves, and
They
so,
interbreed though.
yeah,
Yeah,
that makes.
there's some idea that there's hybrids of them out there. I just think it's very interesting, because you do population genetics and stuff like that, to think that two species that have such completely dissimilar social behavior actually can still interbreed. In principle, chimps and bonobos don't interbreed in the wild because bonobos and chimps have very different attitudes to water. Chimps don't like water; they won't swim anywhere, and so that they don't.
Well, I
They
mean,
in principle.
so I think in evolutionary biology we call this probably allopatric speciation,
Yeah.
where the bonobos are south of the Congo River and chimpanzees are north and east and west of the Congo River, and so they can't cross the Congo River, and that's how the speciation happened. But like you said, they're socially very, very different. Chimpanzees tend to be, I'll say patrilineal, and tend to much more aggression. Bonobos are the opposite. I think they're matrilineal, less aggression, more sex, and I guess what you're implying here is it's not learned behavior; it's hardwired, and yet they can still hybridize, right?
Yeah, they can still hybridize. So my first ever job when I was 19 was working at a place called the Language Research Center in Decatur, Georgia, and they had a bonobo breeding program, and they also had 4 chimps there, and the chimps could use symbols to communicate with language. And it was actually a bunch of behaviorists ran that particular center, and so that was one of the formative experiences for me, was working with great apes at that time. They also had rhesus macaques at that same center. Anyway, they ended up moving the bonobos out, but the bonobos were actually quite aggressive to humans. There were 2 of the bonobo researchers were missing fingers from the bonobo working with bonobos. So
Yeah, so and that is actually something that I wonder about, in terms of we have these stylized ideas of the peaceful, sexy ape, and then chimpanzees are crazy, and they'll rip your face off. Common chimpanzees, and these are stylized facts, and they do reflect something in reality, but there's a distribution of behaviors, right? Just like human beings, we can be quite peaceful and zen, or we can be like crazy. And so, if there were anthropologists studying humans, like, depending on which, Japanese, very warlike people in the 1940s, and now today, not, they're like not very warlike, so I mean, how do we generalize that sort of thing? And I think our prior as human beings is we have culture, we're special, but I mean, are we like, how are you sure, because like I don't know this field as well, how are you sure that common chimpanzees and bonobos differ because they're hardwired to be different?
I mean, the experience that I have was when they were raised in captivity, and Sue Savage Rumbaugh, who is this woman who founded the center that I worked at, she actually raised a baby chimp and a baby bonobo together and taught them symbolic language together, and they still had different calls and they still had quite different behavior. So I think that's one indication. But I can't necessarily be sure. I was reminded of Robert Sapolsky in this conversation, who has I don't know if it's a whole book or most of a book about how he studied a baboon troop where the culture was fundamentally changed by the death of a couple of individuals. So that's quite interesting. But I think, given that when they're raised in captivity, they show quite similar behavior. You do see bonobos raised in captivity GG rubbing, and you don't see chimpanzees doing that, even if they're raised with bonobos.
Okay, I mean, so that's a pretty big difference. And so what you're saying here is there's hardwired behaviors, which are not shocking. As people, we have children. You see mannerisms in your children at a very early age, and even if like the father's out of the house a lot because he's working, you see certain mannerisms, and obviously it's somehow hard coded into the brain. There's probably some hard coding combined with some sort of priming, some like inputs obviously come in, and they behave in a particular way. And so it's not like shocking to me. I am looking at just like the literature real quickly. You're talking about hybridization. It looks like certain chimpanzee groups have hybridized in the
Yeah, there's also
Congo in the last,
subspecies of chimps. Yeah.
yeah, in the past like 500,000 years, which that's kind of like, I mean, Neanderthals and modern humans, our stem lineage, or African lineage separated like 750, 800,000, maybe on the high end years ago. So this is not trivial because they have a shorter lifespan, and they've been hybridizing. So we have these two apes that are kind of quite different in a very biological way, biobehavioral way, and they can still hybridize, which indicates that probably the best experiment as we're talking would be a hybrid population, like someone, I don't know, like maybe some billionaire, like maybe Elon Musk could fund this. Like, let's create like a troop of like F1s, Filio ones of hybrid common chimpanzees and bonobos. And the hypothesis, if the behavioral differences is hardwired, is that they should behave intermediate,
Yeah. It's just you're talking about people that are like hardwired in genetics. I know somebody who was really red pilled about genetics because he found out that he was the product of sperm donation when he was in his 20s. And so he thought his parents had really done everything for him, and that they had really strived to give him all available opportunities to make him smart. And then when he found out that his dad, the dad that raised him, wasn't his real dad, he's like, "Oh, okay, it's all genes." So yeah, that's definitely a great way to get red pilled.
Well, I mean, okay, I think let's do that. Let's do the segue here. So you are an editor, or you're a contributor at Aporia,
Yeah.
which that's a weird word. I'm not
It
gonna
is a weird
lie,
word. Yeah.
but you wrote about eugenics. You've been writing about eugenics. Like you guys have been,
Just this year.
yeah.
Just since
This
I
is
left the game. Just since I left academia, yeah. If you're
yeah.
gonna
You've been
leave
writing a lot.
academia, you might as well go for it.
Yeah. And so talk about your eugenics piece and how people, okay, here's the thing with eugenics. This is a term that's been used so much that people have different definitions. So the original term about eugenics in the late 19th, really early 20th century, it was actually pre-genetic insofar as the original eugenicists were actually not Mendelian. They were against the Mendelites, if you want to say, although they eventually, became converts. And they had this idea that they wanted to improve the germ plasm of the species. It was like out of the Galtonian tradition, and it was about these heritable characteristics. Today, eugenics is kind of a slur, just like, I don't know, racist or something like that. And
Yeah.
so, for example, people have pointed this out. There is a termination, there's prenatal screening for Down syndrome, et cetera, et cetera. People abort Down syndrome fetuses quite frequently. In certain countries, they're almost gone, like in Iceland and Denmark. Is that eugenics? So technically, that is not eugenics because those
Yeah.
individuals have very low fertility anyway. So it's not really having a long term change in the species, germ plasm or whatever. But I think most people colloquially will say that's eugenics. And so I don't really know how to handle this because I've done like the nerdy response. Well, actually, that's not real and then people are like, look at you like you're a dork, and you kind of are being a dork. So I've given in, and then I've encountered people who do the same thing to me. They're like, well, actually, that's not really eugenics. And I was like, okay, I know it's not. But colloquially, everyone assumes it is, and so, I mean, how do you first of all, how do you deal? What do you define eugenics for me? Like, tell me how you
Yeah.
deal with the definition wars.
Okay, so let me just do a brief preamble about how tricky it is to define eugenics. Eugenics has become difficult to define for a variety of reasons. Like you said, before people knew what genetics were like. So, for example, when a mother transmitted syphilis to her baby and her baby ended up blind or deaf, right? They thought that that was genetic. And so treating syphilis became a eugenic endeavor because they thought that was genetic at the time. So there's a lot of stuff that, was considered eugenic, but now we know it doesn't have anything to do with genetics. Also, there's a problem with if you malign eugenics, then you end up defining eugenics in a very weird way because you want to exclude all the stuff that you agree with and include all the stuff that you disagree with. So, like Catherine Page Harden in the Genetic Lottery, she says eugenics is all stuff that contributes to inequality. Adam Rutherford and some other people who you define eugenics, they basically say individual choices cannot be eugenics. It's only top-down control. And then when you get into stuff like, is mandatory prenatal screening that's subsidized by the government eugenics, nobody wants to touch that because that's something that all progressives agree with. So to me, eugenics is anything that is meant to improve the genetic or desirable, increase the rate of desirable genetic qualities and decrease the rate of undesirable genetic qualities in the future. And, again, also with COVID, people were saying that, people not wearing masks was eugenic because in some sense it was going to kill off everybody who had a bad immune system. So everything from, giving out free birth control to literal murder could be considered eugenics. And it's become very muddied. Just this week, actually, Colin Wright and some other people were looking at this paper that said that trans men who are natal females should be allowed to take testosterone when they're pregnant because the concern about how testosterone would influence a fetus is eugenic or it's redolent of eugenics or whatever. So it's become incredibly muddied, but my version of it actually includes a lot of stuff that people find desirable, things like prenatal screening, but also includes things that people find undesirable, like paying people to get sterilized.
Yeah, so definitionally what you're pointing to there is positive versus negative eugenics. Positive eugenics is, okay, you want the characteristics that you favor to increase. Negative eugenics is the opposite. Disfavored characteristics should decrease. And negative eugenics, traditionally has been done through also like top-down coercion. And that's why, it's called negative eugenics and it has like a negative odor. A lot of people, I have traditionally, I don't use the word anymore just because it's like too toxic, but personalized genomic choice, like genomic libertarianism. I don't know. People make individual choices.
Yeah.
Yeah. What were you saying?
I was just going to say, one thing that I should go back to is that the person who came up with the term eugenics was Francis Galton. And when Francis Galton was talking about eugenics, he was not talking about top-down control. He was interested in developing a culture in which people considered genetic concerns when they got together with other people, when they mated, and when they got married. He wanted to have a eugenic culture as opposed to any top-down kind of control. And yeah, what you're talking about is sometimes called liberal eugenics or reprogenics, which is, things like polygenic screening, giving people a choice about what children to bring into the world.
So an interesting point here, though, is also, we're talking about technology, polygenic screening, abortion, all of this stuff, right? It's very, post 19th century tech.
Yeah.
But who you select as your sperm or egg donor, who you marry, that is also eugenical.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You are doing polygenic screening. Like, so women want a man who's 6 inches taller than them. That is polygenic screening for height.
Yeah, in some sense that is polygenic screening. Yeah. It's interesting when you look at the culture war about this, because I actually really admire progressives who are willing to bite the bullet and say, no, you shouldn't be able to predict, you shouldn't be able to choose a sperm donor on the basis of their height, or we should have 5'4" sperm donors in our banks. Of course, you would see in terms of selection that they would probably be unlikely to get selected. But certainly men under 6 feet tall do get selected as sperm donors. So yes, if you say personal choice cannot be eugenics, it's actually a lot of progressive lefty, people like Dialectic Bio on Twitter, who hates me, who actually brought to mind that personal choice can be eugenics, because people like Rebecca Sear were saying, oh no, she criticizes me in one of her papers and says, Diana Fleischman says, that personal choice or prenatal screening can be eugenics, but it's not, because people are not thinking about the good of the species, even if it might have eugenic outcomes. And what these progressive historians of eugenics have said is actually what Galton meant was not top-down control. And so it doesn't make any sense to make this bright line, although it is easier to make a bright line and say eugenics is just racist stuff, or just increasing the prevalence of white people. That's a common definition. Or only top-down control that's coercive, another common definition. So in my piece, which is called You're Probably a Eugenicist, I just lay out, why eugenics shouldn't be used as a slur, because I was very annoyed by the discourse around modern technology, where people were saying, something like So there's this guy called George Church. He came up with an app idea called Digidate, where it's like a Tinder app, but you would upload your genome into there and it wouldn't match you with somebody who has a genome where you would make babies that would have potentially serious disorders, something like, Tay-Sachs. And people were calling this eugenics. And the point that I was making is, yes, it is eugenics, and that's fine. So you actually can't learn anything morally by using the word eugenics. And certainly I've been criticized. People have said, oh, we shouldn't try to reclaim the word at all. But you could say this is an annoying semantic battle. But certainly when it comes to something like euthanasia, 10 years ago, people were saying, or 15 years ago, they were saying you shouldn't use the word euthanasia to talk about helping somebody die who's in pain, because it was a word that the Nazis used. And now people use it very easily. And I think reclaiming the word has helped increase the popularity of, what they would call death with dignity, which is another nice way of saying, killing people who want to die. So, yeah.
Well, so one thing I will say is, these lexical treadmills that are going on. I mean, in terms of eugenics, we do know that prenatal screening, you are, I mean, I think I can say this, you're pregnant again, like you have been pregnant before. A lot of people who are childless, child-free, or are too young to be at that stage of life don't know that now, like, women routinely get a blood draw and they are told, like, about a dozen, I think now, genetic conditions, including Down syndrome, uh, of the fetus, and they
Yeah.
may do verification, but the point here is we are engaged in the last 10 years in this massive, massive, biomedical experiment. And the only people that discuss this are, social conservatives and pro-life people. And if I point this out, like, and I think you've probably done it too, if you point out this fact that this is probably the biggest eugenic quote unquote change in society in the last decade, it's silence. Why is it silence? My hypothesis is this is just self-interest. People in academia are actually doing this because they have children later. It's them. So when they make the choices, it can't be bad.
If you're somebody who maligns eugenics, you're generally somebody who is unwilling to bite any bullet. This is my experience with people who are like progressive, anti-eugenicists. And so if you say I'm against women having prenatal testing to choose whether or not they're going to bring a baby to term that has a severe disability, then you don't want to bite that bullet, because saying that a woman shouldn't be able to terminate a pregnancy is something that social conservatives say, and they don't want to be on the wrong side of that divide, right? So, an individual woman is probably not making a choice on the basis of how she wants to change the genetics of the population. But certainly if a government subsidizes prenatal testing, they are having a eugenic effect on the population.
Yeah, and the government does in various ways, tax credit. I mean, with Obamacare in the United States, socialized medicine in Europe, and the NHS. So these are really, really live questions, and you've jumped into it. In a way, it's interesting because the technology is kind of incrementally, bringing us to all these sorts of screening. People are doing in vitro, they're screening their, embryos, they're doing all these sorts of things. It's happening, but we're not really talking about it, and it becomes normalized. And then eugenics is the next. It's like the next thing that hasn't been done yet. You bring up like the racial issues. Again, the media doesn't platform this. Nobody amplifies this, but if you go to pro-life websites, they talk about genocide against Black people because in the United States, abortion is really, really skewed towards Black Americans and to a lesser extent, Latinx Americans. So they talk about it, and like, yeah, you're laughing but you know what? It's ironic.
No, I didn't know if it was ironic. Okay,
it's ironic. Only right wing people say Latinx now. That's just a thing.
I didn't know that.
Like we've reclaimed it, because and like to my Latinx brothers and sisters out there, I'm being ironic. Do not. Yeah, I got, what, like I'm gonna talk about this real quick. I was at like a social event, and I said someone was Latinx. They took offense because they were Latinx. Next thing I know, like 3 swarthy males have surrounded me, and are daring me to call them Latinx, and I did, and it was a tense moment. There is some Latinx rage, I guess, about the fact that apparently like 10 years ago, some white women in a conference boardroom decided to rename a whole ethnicity. They're not happy about it. Like, they're Latinx and they're not going to take it anymore. So anyway, be careful out there. Like this sort of like ironic usage of the term. I've had some experiences, so you got to be careful. But yeah, I mean, in terms of abortion, it does have disparate impact. That's what literally disparate impact is. And so the pro-life faction, the pro-life group in the United States was like 40% of the population. They've been talking about it for decades, and it gains no traction because, as Jonathan Haidt would say, abortion is a sacred value on the left.
Yeah. Yeah. And, there is some interesting evidence about abortion being eugenic, which is obviously, unfortunately, tied up with this race. So there's this guy, Donahue and Levitt, the guys who came up with Freakonomics. And there's this data now that shows that one of the main drivers of the reduction in crime in the 90s was the legalization of abortion. And deletting, probably had something to do with it too. But they were, there was synchronicity between those two things. It's not one or the other. And they assiduously, Donahue and Levitt, avoid talking about any kind of genetic effects, like maybe somebody who is careless enough to get pregnant is also somehow predisposed to have a child who's careless enough to, or not conscientious enough to avoid breaking the law. There's also this idea that homicides were decreased by the legalization of abortion, which is another thing that the right really hates, even though they're tough on crime. They hate this idea. But anyway, in Donahue and Levitt, there are two papers which cover more than 20 years of data on abortion and crime rates. They say that the important factor in why children who would have been aborted if abortion was legal go on to commit crimes is because they're unwanted. They talk about unwantedness as opposed to any kind of genetic factor. But these papers convince me absolutely that that legal abortion has a eugenic component to it. Even there are certainly edgelords online who say that it's not, because but I think it definitely does.
Well, I mean, I love this about you, but like you're like Ishmael, like your hand is against every other man, So it's just like we have these social justice warriors on the left that are coming at you, and you're like throwing out like casual comments about how abortion is eugenic, and I'm sure that my pro-life listeners are just like gouging their eyes out right now. What impels you to like are you hardwired to be just like very disagreeable and casual about throwing? I mean, I know you used to be vegan. Like you obviously have an interest in extremism of various
An
sorts.
interest in extremism. You're making me sound like I used to belong to ISIS. I'm disagreeable, and I think that the topics that piss people off are just more interesting. I guess maybe it's like a combination of being disagreeable and easily bored. I don't know. And there's this idea called high decoupling, which is where you can think about things in the abstract. So that's one aspect of it. But another aspect of I don't know, being unusual, if I'm going to talk about myself for a moment, is that I'm also very disgust insensitive. Remarkably disgust insensitive for a woman. So things that are, other people find repugnant, like moral questions, I enjoy them. I enjoy them because they're spicy. I enjoy them because they piss people off, and I enjoy them because they, make me have intense feelings that I enjoy ignoring to try and get at the heart of the matter.
Well, I'm disagreeable, but I don't have your issues. I don't have your insensitivity discussed. As anyone who's met me, I mean, Diana like makes fun of me about this. I have a particular face that that I do, and everyone knows that I do this face if I'm disgusted by things. So it's interesting because I feel like we're similar in some ways, but then in other ways, not so much. And it just shows that there's a diverse way to get to the position where we are. I do think that I do enjoy. We're not predictable, partly because like I feel like you're not like checking the temperature all the time. and you're not reading the room and seeing. So a lot of what we're talking about here, when you're talking about eugenics, it's very confusing to me because if you didn't immerse yourself in a particular subculture, you wouldn't know why they're ignoring this or that. Okay, so for example, social justice oriented progressive thinkers are not going to write about how in vitro fertilization and prenatal screening is eugenic or problematic. I mean, some of them do, but that's very rare. And I do believe that they don't do that. From an outside perspective, people would wonder, well, why aren't they talking about this? Well, they're not talking about this because their tribe has decided that these are good things.
Yeah.
Even if go on, Diana.
So the other big article that I wrote, so I wrote You're Probably a Eugenicist. I don't know if you do show notes, Razib, but you should for me. You're Probably a Eugenicist is one, and the other one is Polygenic Screening, Healthy Babies versus Bad Arguments. In that second one, I really take aim at a progressive darling called Adam Rutherford, who's a BBC presenter. And in his book, it's really interesting, actually, in terms of a culture war, how assiduously he avoids biting a bullet. So he talks about polygenic screening just for IQ and height, which are problematic, but not for health, which would be considered unproblematic, right? And so Simone and Malcolm Collins, who have been in they're pronatalists. They're people who think that everybody should have more kids. They're actually not people who think that only some people should have more kids. They're not really eugenicists, actually. And they say, essentially, that polygenic screening is good because they're having the healthiest children they can, and they chose their children, their most recent child, on the basis of a health score provided by genomic prediction. And specifically, they wanted to avoid having a daughter who would die of the same cancer that her grandmother died of. And if you look at the culture war response to this, I think that I'm a psychologist. It's just very interesting to look at how people would respond to, let's say, somebody trying to have a child who has the lowest rate of mental illness versus someone trying to have a child who has the highest IQ versus someone trying to have a child who's less likely to die of cancer. And it's this avoidance of people using polygenic scoring for this particular issue, which is the healthiness of their children. And this is to get back to you, Razib. I think this is one reason why you are willing to be spicy and bite bullets in some respects, because you're really pronatalist. You love your children, and you love children generally, and you love family. And I think that this drives you to think about how to have a better next generation, as opposed to just wanting to be edgy.
Yeah, I mean, it's not abstract. It's concrete, is what you're saying. Like, I have some skin in the game, literally, and so I think one of the issues that people don't want to acknowledge is that humans vary, and human variation matters. Okay, so for example, I did a Twitter poll recently, and it was a combination, and this was a very evolutionary psychology thing to do, and I see why
saw your polls were so good.
Yeah, I see why you guys do it. The engagement was off the charts, but it was it was basically like I was asking men and women. I was like, okay, IQ, someone who's a 10 out of 10, IQ of 70, someone who's an 8 out of 10, an IQ of, I think, 85, and then someone who's a 6 out of 10, an IQ of 100, and then someone who is a 4 out of 10 and an IQ of 130. Okay. Yeah. And so those of you who just don't know, really quickly, someone who's a 70 is retarded. Literally, I'm not using a pejorative. They're retarded. 70 is retardation. Mental disability, whatever. I don't know. Whatever the cool kids, whatever the term, that's in the bottom, 1 or 2%. And then 85 is the 15th percentile, 100 obviously at the 50th percentile, and 130 is about 2 percentile. So that's a very smart person.
What do you think is the average IQ of the people who are listening right now, Razib?
125.
I think
probably 120.
Probably about right.
Yeah. I think that's about it, right? So you guys, high midwit, Should I not have said that? No, Sri, don't edit that out. I'm gonna get some anger right now, but whatever. Diana's losing it. You guys aren't seeing this. Diana's losing it. What? Should I not have said that?
You called your audience midwits. You're like, I really avoid controversy, but also.
Well, I don't know. Well, I mean, they listen to my podcast. I don't listen to their podcast.
No, so I think, yeah. So when you did that poll, you have to think about the sample that's answering that poll. So how much would a man be able to tolerate a woman with an IQ of 130? Actually, some of the responses were kind of interesting because men were saying how annoying high IQ women are, which I hadn't really thought about before.
Well, I mean, you should meet yourself.
I know I suck.
No, yeah, I mean, so there was a sex difference. Women were less likely to take were like much less inclined to take the trade off of dumb hot, and men were,
Mean.
well, I mean, it wasn't like super skewed, but like, a lot of basically 6 out of 10 and 100 was actually the sweet spot for men. A lot more women picked the 4 out of 10, 130 option. Although a fair number of my like followers on Twitter did pick that are male as well. I mean, that was the option that I would have picked probably. I mean, no, it is the option I picked, literally. Well, not in real life, but I'm like digging myself into a hole here. But what I'm saying is like,
hot. Your wife was hot, whatever wife you have now.
It's interesting because these are conversations that happen on YouTube, just in real life, and they're eugenical conversations, but we don't label them as such.
I think it would be great to do a book. I think Jeffrey's talked about doing this, but I don't know if the zeitgeist is different now than it used to be. But how amazing would it be for there to be a book about like how to pick somebody to have kids with that you'd be genetically compatible with? There's a lot of trade-offs, as we all know, all of us who have kids, and so for me, I waited a long time to have kids, but with somebody who has I don't know. I don't want to brag, but we're really far into this podcast. If you're still here with somebody with a 150 IQ, that was like amazing to me, right? And I'm definitely more interested in having more kids with somebody with a 150 IQ than I would with somebody with a 130 IQ. But I'm explicitly eugenic in my personal life too, although I have not used polygenic screening, for the record.
Okay. Well, I mean, you have, ironically.
I have chosen a mate for polygenic characteristics, but also
because IQ is a polygenic characteristic, and that's what I'm getting at. We don't label it that way, though.
Yeah, and my husband's weaknesses are things that I have. Like I'm almost pathologically cheerful, and so it's fine for me to get together with somebody who's sad sometimes, as opposed to I wouldn't want to get together with somebody else manic. I'd have children that were crazy. So yeah,
and we know that we know that he does not overeat. For sure. He's very. We know that he has self-control about that.
And I'm a hobbit. I'm only 5 feet tall. He's 6 feet tall. So these are all good things. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, the height, for example, there are women and men who have like really extreme preferences. There are guys that I know that are 6 feet. And they only date short women, like women that are below 5'4".
Yeah,
that's all they, and like that's a thing, and we don't need to talk about why it's a thing, but it's a thing. And then
as this woman who's 5 feet tall, I definitely know why the people like it, and like I dated a dude, I think the tallest dude I ever dated was like 6'6", but like I've never, as far as I know, no one's ever rejected me because I'm short, which is crazy, right? Because I am fucking short. So
yeah, I mean, you know what? I'm not gonna this podcast is not about my preferences, so I'm not gonna go there. Like you're
about liking women, and I absolutely think because somebody was saying like, oh, my family, we always got together with smart tall women, and certainly if tall women are like less in demand, you can get a great deal on IQ if you're willing to date somebody tall. I love a tall woman. I date women and men, and I love a tall woman. So yeah, fine.
Okay. We just went into TMI territory. Although I guess you can see that on your Twitter feed, so I guess it's not TMI, right? We just broke the podcast wall here, and the social media is bleeding in. So what is So you're doing this stuff for Aporia. You guys are doing edgy stuff. Tell me about Aporia. Actually, I mean, I know people involved in it. I was on its earlier. There was an earlier incarnation. I was on the
Yeah.
podcast like a year ago, before you took over. And I mean, I have to say, and I've told you this privately, you are a good podcast host, and it's not because you're a high midwit. That's also like you know. No, I mean,
Yeah,
we
I
all
mean,
know that,
I'm
yeah,
really cornering the market on like Jewy. I mean, there's whatever the Aporia audience is probably like, I don't know, 90% male if I'm being generous, 95% male.
yeah.
And so yeah, when I started talking to Aporia and I was like, hey, why don't I do a podcast for you? And they were like, okay, cool, let's negotiate. And I was like, I know I'm in a good bargaining position because there's like one race realist woman who's like not doesn't have autism that you might know. I mean, I'm being really cheeky, but so yeah, Aporia does edgy shit. It's about immigration. It's about polygenic screening. It's about eugenics. It's about whether there are race differences and sex differences. There's a really cool interview with somebody who's an expert on Galton. Galton was like a fascinating character, but we'll publish anything from anybody. My editor Matt, he published a deeply religiously conservative uh, rebuttal to my polygenic screening essay saying, I'm commodifying people and that's not a Catholic thing to do. So, we're happy to take stuff from people. And I'm really proud to work for them because it's kind of one of a kind in terms of the kinds of stuff that we tackle. So, they're collecting some canceled academics. Bo Weingard, who was canceled for being a eugenicist, even though he's not one. He works for
No,
them. And then
I have to say, Bo Weingard believes in human dignity. So, go on.
actually, we were talking about the wisdom of repugnance. We're talking about maybe me and Bo will do a wisdom of repugnance because like I'm totally discuss sensitive and he's like even more discuss sensitive than you, Razib. So it'd be interesting to do a conversation with him. But yeah, I do interviews there. I mean, it's going to be a little while, but there's things that are going to get released. There's an interview with Simone Collins. There's an interview with Ayala that will come out. I'm going to not work for a little while because I'm having a baby in literally 10 days. And then I also write a book called How to Train Your Boyfriend. It's about, I don't know, half drafted, and I got an extension on that. And it's a behaviorist treatment of human relationships, a behaviorist evolutionary psychology treatment of human relationships. And that's another thing that people find disgusting, which I enjoy.
Wait, what? Wait, they find behaviorism or evolutionary? Wait, what do they
Yeah,
find?
they find any idea that people are consciously or unconsciously manipulating each other. If you have a child, this is maybe another thing about childlessness. Children are incredibly manipulative. Some people, I guess, are averse to that idea. They think that's disgusting. But yeah, the whole premise is that we are always using different kinds of techniques. You can call it manipulation, you can call it control, or you can just call it influence to try to change one another's behavior. And that's for evolutionary reasons. Our survival as individuals depended on how much other people were willing to help us, other people were willing to be nice to our kids, how much other people were willing to avoid doing things that would harm us. And if you can control other people's behavior, if there's a paradigm for that, which there is, it's called behaviorism, then why would that not be instantiated in human psychology? So that's the premise of How to Train Your Boyfriend.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's news you can use. That was a tagline for U.S. News, which I don't know if that's true anymore. But so a lot of evolutionary psychology, I feel like this about population genetics as well. Okay, so for example, people are like, oh, well, you want to get a smart person, blah, 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 for your offspring. And there's like, okay, you just do like a formula, like a modified form of the Breeder's equation, do regression to the mean. You can calculate the expected value, use the population sample variance as your, offspring sample variance. So you can like do some back of the envelope automatically, right? And I feel like evolutionary psychology is quite similar. It's very, very applied science in that way. And I know Jeffrey Miller, your husband, has written some stuff in that vein more recently. And so, it's going to have utility, and it's going to be contentious because, it's like therapy, like anything in the public eye. It's not like you guys are doing solid state physics, something that is important, but is not controversial, right? It is controversial. Although, I feel like, as we're closing out, I mean, what do you think is the biggest misconception of people about evolutionary psychologists? Because I mean, I will tell you what I think. I think a lot of people in academia, in particular, for some bizarre reason, think evolutionary psychologists are reactionaries, and
Yeah.
they're
There's a
pretty
survey.
normie liberals, right?
Yeah, so Josh Tybur published a study back in, I think, 2008 about the political inclinations of evolutionary psychologists. They're largely progressive. So, yeah, people think that evolutionary psychologists just make stuff up. Certainly, there's a lot of armchair evolutionary psychologists and a lot of popular evolutionary psychology, which is just made up stuff. But there's a lot of, I think, much harder evolutionary psychology. There's an unsavory connection with evolutionary psychology and reactionaries in the pickup artist community, which is not something that I think evolutionary psychology has cultivated. Certainly, if you give people information that corresponds with a cynical view of humanity, they're interested in it. So I don't think that, pickup artists or reactionaries, there's a reason they like evolutionary psychology, but it's not because evolutionary psychologists have courted them. And I think those are the two main ones. People like Ed Haig. I mean, I've certainly, it's been a while since I've been to an evolutionary psychology conference for a variety of reasons, but certainly people like me and Jeffrey are not considered, core. People are iffy about us because we are more right of center or more centrist than the average evolutionary psychologist is.
Okay, yeah. So I will put all the links. Like we discussed a lot of things that you actually wrote about. So I'll put the links in the show notes, and obviously find you at Aporia. And I did tell you this privately, so I'll tell you this again on the podcast so people know. You are a good interviewer. You are quite entertaining. Good content, as they say. So I do recommend it. There are some people who are not as dynamic, and so even if the topics are interesting, it's kind of a snooze fest. It's never like that with you, Diana. So I really recommend the
You
podcast
just
you're
got to sprinkle
hosting.
in jokes. You got to smile and sprinkle in jokes. You got to give people a little bit of respite from serious stuff every once in a while, like every few minutes. You can't
Well,
just
okay,
drag
so
on to the serious.
here's one thing. Like, as we close out, I'm just gonna put this out there. It's the end, just so people know. Your name is Diana Fleischman, and people think you're a woman of the Jewish persuasion. Which which you are somewhat, but the reality is you're not very Jewish. So why don't you just like tell people that?
I'm a quadroon, as you would say.
Yeah.
I'm a
Don't get me in trouble
45,
again.
so I won't get
Yeah.
you in trouble again. I've already gotten you in trouble. So my father's father was a German Jew, Walter Fleischman. Then he married a woman who is mixture of various things: German, Czech, French, mostly German. And then my mother is Portuguese, tiny Portuguese lady. So I'm half Portuguese, a quarter Ashkenazi, and a quarter mostly German.
Yeah. So my point here is like you're actually a Latinx woman.
That's right.
You're not a
I'm
Jewish
Latinx.
woman. And people don't know that. So I just wanted to put that out there. You are twice as Latinx and you are Jewish, despite your name. And so with that like big reveal, I will close this podcast. And congratulations on the new baby soon, and good luck on
Thanks.
everything. All right, it
Thanks for having
was
me on. Bye.
great talking to you.
This podcast for kids